about 2001, roughly, approximately, I received a letter from IIT Kharagpur that they were planning their 50th anniversary celebration and wanted sponsors for various conferences they were going to hold. So I asked them for a list of conferences, and the one that interested me was called Mind Sciences. My training is in physics. I did physics honors in St. Stephen's College, switched to computer science, ran some tech companies, then returned back to this idea of mind sciences. And for 20 years, that's what I'm researching and writing about. So I wrote back to them saying that the Mind Sciences conference intrigues me, but before I decide, I would like to know what is the program for the Mind Sciences conference. They sent me a list of speakers and topics. I was not surprised but disappointed that they were all talking about Western mind sciences, Western models of mind, Western psychology, not a single Indian model of mind. So I wrote back to them saying I'm interested in sponsoring, provided at least one panel out of this conference should be on Indian mind sciences. I wrote to them that there has been a great background to Indian mind sciences and they should be featured. I got back a letter, which I keep to this day, which said that, sir, we are not chauvinists, we are scientists. We are only interested in real science, things like that. So obviously the implication was that there is no real Indian mind science. I got hold of some Westerners who are practitioners of different kinds of Indian mind sciences. For instance, one person who's head of Tibet House is a Buddhist meditator and researcher and doing a lot of research on the effects of this meditation upon mind. Then there is somebody who was at Cambridge who had translated the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali as probably the earliest known work of psychology in the world. Then there were people who were practitioners of psychiatrists and mental health people, neuroscientists, some of them practicing Kundalini, some of them practicing different kinds of techniques, different cognitive techniques from India. They were all friends of mine. They'd been doing this for a long time and quite proud of it and propagating it as part of their research. So I called these people and said that I would like to sponsor a panel if you guys go to Kharagpur, but make sure that when you speak, you do not replace the Sanskrit words with English substitutes just to sound modern. Do not hide the Indian sources. Do not hide how you learnt it, who taught you in India, how you practiced it for 20, 30 years. Do not hide how you benefit in the US or in UK, how it's part of scientific inquiry. I want you to be very clear about all these things. Are you willing to go? And they said, of course, that's what we do all the time. We'd be happy to go to India. We never before got an invitation from India. So I took their biodatas and their abstracts and I sent it to IIT Kharagpur people saying that's the kind of panel I would like. Because these were Western people, it was immediately accepted. Immediately accepted. That was my trick, that's what I wanted. So when they came, Western people, from big prestigious places, from Cambridge, from Columbia, from all these kind of famous places, they all got standing ovations here in this hall. And they all wrote back to me that people are very impressed that this whole thing was very successful Then they got invitations from various universities around India to go give talks on Indian mind sciences. So we started funding Westerners to reintroduce Indian mind sciences into India in a way that would bypass the mental block. And today we have a discipline being taught in Indian universities called Indian psychology, and there's about over 200 Indian scholars in various universities who are in psychology departments who consider themselves to be specialists in Indian psychology. This has happened over the last 12 years. So this is an example of how one can change people's blocked minds. Now the real issue in this area is that the Indian practitioners, yogis, practitioners of the past, and profound thinkers claimed a model of self, consciousness, mind, which is very recently being accepted in the West, and which is now at the cutting edge of cognitive science and neuroscience in some of the leading R&D centers. So you go to Harvard and you'll see Herb Benson's laboratory doing this kind of research. But of course they don't tell you that he got it from Transcendental Meditation. You go to Stanford and you see Stephen LaBerge talking about lucid dreaming as a state of mind which can help certain problems, which can give you creativity. But lucid dreaming is yoga nidra. He talks about it privately, but in his published work he claims it as his own original discovery. You see Vipassana renamed mindfulness meditation, and based on that there are many neuroscientific and cognitive scientific clinical therapies like dialectic behavior therapy, which is considered one of the cutting edge therapies for various kinds of issues, and that is considered to be the discovery of some people in the West, but when you ask them and interview them, they'll tell you they got it from India. So on the one hand, some of the most cutting edge breakthroughs in the understanding of the mind are coming from India. On the other hand, these things are not known in India, at least among the Westernized elite, who feel that these must be old-fashioned or these must be somehow, suspect. And yet, after the Westerners have appropriated this, repackaged it, turned it into a new vocabulary, claimed some trademarks and patents and whatnot, and then it's brought here, it's considered to be latest cutting edge. This is an interesting syndrome that I'm researching. I call it the U-turn theory. Knowledge goes, U-turns, comes back. For instance, there is a favorite management training, management education model by Howard Gardner, a Harvard guy, Harvard professor, now very senior. This model is called multiple intelligences, which means that a person has many kinds of intelligence, not just one. Many different kinds of intelligences, and so you have to educate and develop and nurture many kinds of intelligences to have a total being. And he is brought by Tatas and Infosys and a very big shot who is taken around to teach us the latest. But if you go back to see where he got it from, you find that Sri Aurobindo had written something called planes and parts of being, which means that the person has many planes and there are many parts. And he explained them in minute detail and described that you have to develop each of these part of yourself. So these Sri Aurobindo planes and parts of being, unheard of in the Indian corporate life, now get reintroduced from an American as a trademarked proprietary new idea called multiple intelligences, and it's a bestseller. So there is this sort of a thing that I'm interested in researching. Now one of the most important concepts which has resulted from the input from the Indian side started when Swami Vivekananda went to Harvard in the 1890s. And one of the persons who invited him was William James, who was the head of philosophy at Harvard. And a lot of these exchanges and interactions with William James and also Tesla the scientist, are very interesting to read because they tell you the kind of impact that Vivekananda had on the scientific minds in the US at the time. And after Vivekananda's few trips, the people who followed him and started practicing some of his ideas became extremely important people. Some got Nobel Prizes, some affected modern psychology, neuroscience, physics, and things like that. So I am tracing that to see where those ideas went and what else has been brought in from the Indian subcontinent into the West, and how these kind of things have been utilized. One of the important ideas and practices is what in the West is called first-person empiricism. We are used to third-person empiricism. So I'm the observer and I'm outside the thing being observed through a telescope, through a microscope, through whatever. I'm outside the object being observed. There is a separation between the observer and the observed. In between there is an instrument. And I can measure and I can make models. I can then decide whether these models are good or not. I can make better models. So this is called scientific empiricism, as you know. But this is actually third-person empiricism because I'm looking at it as something third person. The question is, what about first person? How relevant and how valid are observations that a person makes in their own laboratory? So this is where particularly Buddhist meditators did a huge amount of work on first person, what is now called first person empiricism, and also Jain meditators who were able to create a certain stillness. You know, a laboratory has to be very clean. If the laboratory is noisy, if the instrument is noisy, you cannot make observations. So if you're looking through a telescope, you don't want any disturbances, so you put the telescope in a very clean place. If the telescope is shaking because you are on a horseback, you're not going to see much because the telescope is shaking. Or you put it on a boat and the boat is shaking. So you have to put it where it's still, and then the resolution can be fine. Similarly, the normal mind, the ordinary mind, is very noisy. It's jittery. It doesn't have clarity, stillness, attention span. It's just full of perturbations. And you don't know this because you're so busy with different things. You do not know this until you go into very deep stillness. Then you appreciate what new insights you get, which ordinarily you don't get. So Buddhists in the modern era, in collaboration with modern scientists, coined the term first-person empiricism. What in our tradition would be called Adhyatma Vidya, means inner knowledge, inner science, the science of the inner laboratory, where I become my own laboratory. And the cleaning of the instruments and creating fine resolution is a matter of inner practices which our tradition has. So it is not about religion, it is not about something, quackery, it's about understanding and improving the quality of the instrument of observation, which is the mind itself. Because if that is noisy and that is cluttered, then you're not going to get a whole lot of reliable data. Whereas if it's clean, you'll get new insights. So this inner science or Adhyatma Vidya is a kind of science that has been practiced in India for a very long time. And there were peer reviews. So a person would say, I've achieved this, and here's my understanding of what goes on. And another person may disagree. he may try teaching it to other students. They try it for a while, and then they become experts and they record and report their data, their experiences. So over time, because of people learning from others, practicing, reporting their data, it becomes similar to scientific inquiry where people make observations in a laboratory, come up with models, and report on them. So this kind of an inner science has been there for a very long time, and recently it is at the cutting edge of in the West of cognitive science and neuroscience. You go to major laboratories, huge funding from the government, from pharmaceutical companies and so on. They're looking at these as sort of the next frontier. Now, Indian meditators also claimed that there is a state of consciousness so clear, so still, and so profound that from that state, when they establish contact with a certain object, there is such a deep unity between observer and observed that they can come up with new insights about this object. And they can discover even about the external world. So for example, and we do not know how it works. Today we do not know, we do not have a theory on how it works. But data cannot be rejected just because it violates our models. If there is data that is established, but this data violates our models, then it should provoke creativity rather than rejection. So for example, Chinese medicine, Chinese acupuncture works, empirically it works, but it doesn't fit the modern Western model of medicine. That doesn't mean you reject it. In fact, the Chinese government spends a huge amount of money promoting the Chinese system of healing because it works. It's very cost effective, but you cannot explain it in a modern scientific model. So it means that the model is not complete. Now, some of the ancient Sanskrit texts way back have a formula on the velocity of light. And if you look at that formula, while it's not entirely accurate, it's 98, 95% accurate as we know today. But there were no measuring instruments, nothing comparable to modern ways of measuring the velocity of light. You look at names for certain herbal plants. The plant is named for its properties, its medicinal properties. But there's no biological laboratory we know of, no botanical laboratory we know of where somebody may have tested all these plants and figured it out. So how exactly did the inner empiricism produce facts about the outer world? This is a mystery. But this is the kind of mystery that creative scientists, young scientists have to inquire. Rather than being cynical or rejecting it or accepting it as dogma, you have to have a critical eye and inquire into this. Could it be quantum entanglement? We do know that Schrödinger, Heisenberg, many quantum physicists, many philosophers of quantum physics and modern science have now begun to move in the direction of consciousness and consciousness as a very important factor, the observer's consciousness as an important factor in the whole philosophy of quantum mechanics and how it works. So the question arises whether a certain very deep and clean higher state of consciousness is a sort of an entangled state with the item being observed, and through that some kind of an insight, some kind of a measurement of the other side, the other object can be obtained. It's just a possibility, but it's a worthwhile hypothesis that you should look into. Now, Indians also introduced a lot of original mathematics, but often gave no proof. There are a lot of theorems about infinite series and things like that came out of India long before Europe. And these got translated into Arabic and then later into Latin. And Europeans thought that this is Arabic origin, but these were the Arabic people themselves in their books wrote that they translated from Sanskrit or Malayali or something like that. And even recently, 100 years ago, Ramanujan, the genius number theorist, came up with a huge number of statements about numbers, prime numbers and all kind of number statements he made, which turned out to be true. Some of them were not true even, but most of them were true, but not known. Nobody knew, nobody had thought of those. Highly original. And he gave no proof. He didn't deduce it analytically, logically. He just had these insights. So, and he never answered the question, clearly, how do you know? He says, I know. And then it would take a long time to validate it. Some of Ramanujan's theorems were validated long after his death. Even now, they haven't validated all his statements. So there is a mode of scientific inquiry which empirically is able to produce valid results. I've given you some examples, but without proof. So how it works, without instruments, without proof, some kind of mode of inquiry. Now, we also know that computational linguistics today has been based on Panini's Sanskrit grammar. And computational linguistics is certainly a very rational, cutting-edge scientific pursuit. And so Panini's grammar simplified, reduced, collapsed into smaller set of rules is like the engine for natural language processing. Why? And the question is, Panini also, when he comes up with his grammar, he doesn't leave for us a kind of derivation. He doesn't say that, he doesn't give an argument saying, here is why it should be this way. He just states, statement after statement after statement. And it has survived for so long, it became the it became the origin of modern linguistics in Europe. In the 1800s, when people were studying Sanskrit, then they started applying those principles to create grammars for other European languages. That's how modern linguistics started. And even now, it's being used as the basis for computational linguistics. So obviously, it's something extremely profound and done purely by mind, purely by insight by the mind. And had it been a logical deduction, algorithmic deduction, then hopefully he would have left something to that effect. But there's no evidence. It's just like a sudden flash, a huge amount, thousands of lines of code, if you will, giving the rules, but nothing else behind it. And yet it's so phenomenal. So what I'm trying to explain is that there is perhaps a new kind of, or a very old kind of methodology of discovery, which the West is now beginning to appreciate much more than people in this country appreciate. So, if you look at the ideas and the models that are beneath this ancient thought system, you will find that there's a huge amount of complexity, far more complex than a finite world, finite time, finite particles. There's a huge amount of uncertainty built into it, a lot of uncertainty, indeterminateness. Indians are very comfortable with indeterminateness. Hence, no fear of chaos, no obsession with order. It's the nature of things that there's flux. When the moment you try to capture something, it's changed. This sort of a thing is deep in the metaphysics, very deep in the metaphysics. Whereas the West has had a preference for order, finiteness, things you can control, static model, finality. These things are not the Indian ethos in the deep metaphysics. And I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Being Different. And that book, Being Different, unfortunately they don't have any copies of it here today, but it's on Flipkart, basically talks about the Indian thought system's difference from the Western thought systems metaphysically. In attitudes like, comfort with chaos kind of attitude, indeterminateness, nature of time, philosophical, metaphysical constructs are very different. And the Indian discovery of these has been intuitive, inner empiricism, the inner being, the inner laboratory rather than outer. This is a very big difference than the third person outward empiricism that the West has made. Now, these things have value today, not only computational linguistics, but in many ways. For example, there was a man called Lozanov from Eastern Europe during the Cold War. The Soviets sent him to India to see if yogis had extraordinary powers, because there was a myth that these yogis can do extraordinary things. CIA was also doing some experiments to study. Soviets were also doing such experiments to study. So this man was sent, and he came back and reported that the one extraordinary capability he found in Indian yogis was that they had huge memory. They could memorize tens of thousands of verses by heart without notes. They could recite. And so this, as a neuroscientist, he found very strange that this was possible. So a lot of times he was sent back, and after the Cold War, he did some work for UNESCO to study the minds of yogis. And he developed a system called accelerated learning. A lot of people in the US send their kids, young kids, to special accelerated learning programs so they can learn fast. Languages, mathematics, all kind of things they can learn fast. One of the principles of accelerated learning that he found is that Indians, when they are young, they are singing, they're chanting knowledge to learn. So the singing, the intonation is encoded in the right brain, where art is encoded, and the factual knowledge, the factual data, the analytical data is encoded in the left brain. And since you are singing knowledge, you're encoding in dual brain. It's being recorded both, and there are entanglements between left brain, right brain. It's being encoded both places. And so recall is easier. So the creativity is more. This is his theory. So he wanted to introduce theater, enacting, music, these sort of things as part of learning. Hands-on, tactile, all these, he said, is very important part of learning, which the West didn't have. And now it is being introduced in the West. So we have a project in University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, where there is a Center for Indic Studies, and I'm on the governing board. So we've introduced a project to bring in this Indian knowledge system, this Indian method of learning, into the American school system. And it's supported by the university, which is state university. And one of the experiments is to take children who are going through kindergarten to 12th grade school and see if they can go through it faster, learn faster the entire syllabus, the entire curriculum, using this method of learning. And 1 or 2 batches have been graduated, which went through 7 years to pass 12 years of study. So they passed all the exams to get their certification after high school, but they only spent 7 years in school. And they were not some very genius, original, brilliant people. They were just ordinary people. And yet they were able to produce some extraordinary result. So we know that there's some kind of a mind, approach to the mind and learning, which normal education doesn't have. Now, I could go on and give you many examples of how cognitive science and neuroscience are being affected. That is my field. In fact, I'm in the process of writing a 3-volume on Buddhist influences on modern neuroscience and cognitive science, and then I'll write many others. And it's interesting that huge amount of work, huge amount of knowledge is expropriated from traditional Indian systems, repackaged, reformulated as Western, and then claimed as original. And then there is a whole new history being written of how these ideas have emerged in the West by pioneers. The Indian sources are erased, some of them forgotten, some of them disabused, and this becomes sort of the new knowledge, and Indians love to get this back as some new latest technology or knowledge they're getting from the West. The idea of this is not to take us back to an earlier era, which is a silly thing to do. For one thing, the Indian period way back was 3-4 million people in the total population, and it would not be scalable. You would not be able to scale it for 50 times, 100 times the size, so it would not make any sense. So the idea is to learn from the past to help you go into the future. Learn from the past and help you go into the future. What I would like to do now is, given we have a total of an hour, I would like to stop and take questions, because I think it's more interesting to have an interaction than I could just go on discussing a lot, but I want to hear your views, your questions, your comments, and make it interactive. Thank you for listening.